to some extent that may be true, but still you can do things better, and that's what drives our industry, right? Do things better that are already very good. And the future of dive watches, I think, materials will be important. Weight may be a factor. To me, also functions like a depth gauge, as we offer it in a physical way, just with a canal where the entering water compresses the air, solving actual problems giving you actual information that you need while diving in a mechanical way. That's something that pushes us. So I think, yes, a lot of standards are set, but are we there? I don't think so.
I actually think the future of dive watches has got more to do with bringing awareness to the plight of the oceans and our bodies of water, and this tragedy that is happening right under our noses for the public to take more notice of. And I think all the manufacturers should actually get together and actually have a program of bringing awareness through their dive watches to the compromising of our oceans.
Yeah, and that comes back also to the question of materials. For example, we at Oris, we have launched this summer actually a strap that's made out of recycled PET. And of course, it's not a huge amount of PET that you use, but you make people think about things. And you make people that may not be that close to these topics to get into these problems that we actually have that's threaten our oceans. And I can say that the additions we have done that are in collaboration with projects that actually serve and protect the environment, like the Clipperton expedition that we have done last year, like a watch for the Coral Restoration Foundation down in the Keys that we have done 2 years ago. They always have resonated very well, and I think that there is a lot to do for different brands. If they will ever find together to have one initiative, I doubt, but maybe it's also good to have some competition, so at the end the consumer can decide.
I think it's an awareness thing, like with anything with conservation.
Well, I mean, as a member of the Clipperton party, I was on that expedition actually. I can say that what I saw was truly disturbing, and I would fully agree that if there are resources that can be applied to protecting the ocean, and hey, if they could be paid for by dive watches, all the better. I like that idea. Any other questions? We've got time for maybe one more.
Hi.
Please.
Thank you for doing this. You were mentioning the specifications of dive watches and their functionality. I'm more of a vintage guy, so this is a pretty basic question. As the watches age and they lose their functionality, do they cease to be dive watches? You can no longer take them diving, you can't see the lume. It just becomes form over function at that point.
I think it's interesting that you know, in the collector community, it's often frowned upon that you have replacement hands or a relumed dive. I would argue that with diving watches, a working diver who has owned a watch over a period of years, at least diving tool, you would replace gaskets, you would replace the crystal if it was scratched so that you could see the dial, and you would have new hands put on or have it relumed in order for it to still continue to be a working watch. And you know, I remember I bought an old Omega or something at one point, and it had replacement hands on it, and I was upset by that. And then I've just kind of started to think differently these days and think, okay, if there's a legitimate reason for it, especially with a dive watch, all the better. But modern dive watches don't really deteriorate. I mean, because of materials like, you know, ceramics that are used for bezels, they don't scratch or fade. The super luminova lume just doesn't deteriorate like tritium, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the vintage watches, I I wouldn't dive with them really. It's like kind of like sending a Vietnam vet back to war. You know, it's a bit unfair.
That's a fair point.
Yeah. So.
And I mean, if you're gonna take a vintage race car back to the racetrack, you would essentially make sure it's running as close to possible as the way it was when it was brand new, which may or may not change its value. So it's kind of two different worlds: the collector space versus someone who wanted to dive with an old watch. Maybe we do one more question. We have one more. We do too.
Yeah, I was just wondering if the members of the panel could just mention which watch out of the dive watches that they have they prefer, and maybe the reason.
So which dive watches that we've got that we prefer?
I'm a big. I've got a couple of Rolex and Tudor Submariners in terms of vintage watches, and then I've gone on record as being a real fan of Doxa, which is a brand you don't hear much about, but especially the vintage ones. You know, in the late '60s, they arguably sort of reinvented the recreational dive watch. It was sort of that second wave of diving watches that came along with the oversized minute hand, no decompression scale on the bezel, a clasp on the bracelet that would expand and contract to take up slack in a wetsuit sleeve. This was all done very deliberately, and it was kind of designed from a clean sheet of paper. And so, yeah, those are kind of my favorites.
Rolf, you got the one on wrist there?
Well, I used to have an old writing that I got from my father, and I took it apart, could never put it back together anymore, and then I lost the part. So that was my Culver shear that I wear on holidays, and I really cherish. And yeah, that gives me a lot of joy.
For sure.
I think it would have to be the military Submariner for me because of just the looks of it and the history, and wearing it on a NATO strap. I think it's a historic watch, and it's a fantastic looking watch at the same time as well.
I agree. I mean, you showed us this earlier when we were in the green room, and it's, I mean, it's something else as far as a vintage piece. It's absolutely gorgeous.
Thank you.
And for me, I think if I'm taking a watch diving, I'll take a Seiko. I like a simple dive watch. I like one that if I bang it on a tank and it breaks, I don't have to feel like super bad about it. Arguably, the Seiko that I would have that could go diving now is probably my most sentimental watch. I've had it for a long time, so I guess there's some problem with that math. But yeah, I like a good Seiko. As far as something a little bit more recent than that, yeah, I'm with Jason on. You know, I've had good luck with Doxa, and I've had multiple opportunities to dive with 65s and a Der Meistertacher and the Clipperton LE, the Hammerhead LE. So, I mean, there's a lot of great dive watches to choose from. I mean, you're kind of spoiled for it these days. There's something great at every price point. And let's do one more.
So dive watches don't tend to have a lot of complications, which is something that's come up earlier. But is there a complication that you rarely see or have never seen in a dive watch that you'd like to see or put in a dive watch? Thinking specifically like things like the depth gauge or the tides timer you see in like the old Abercrombie and Fitch dive watches.
I think the most useful complication, if any, is I think it combines two instruments on one wrist. Oris has the Aquas depth gauge. I have an old Aquadive from the early 70s that was an electronic movement, but it had a Bourdon tube depth gauge. Of course, IWC has made them, so we've had a few over the years, but I don't like overly complicated dive watches. I don't think it's as necessary, but depth gauge would be my choice.
Rolf, what do you figure for putting a complication on a dive watch?
Yeah, there are dive chronos, right? Personally, but that's personal taste. I also like them pure and simple. I think a depth gauge makes a lot of sense, obviously. I think a locking feature for the bezel makes a lot of sense. Helium valve is nice, but doesn't really make that much sense for most people, right? So at the end, the dive watch should just be sturdy and simple. And
any use for complications on your dive watches?
I don't think so.
Does a date at this point count?
No, you might as well just put a leap year in there. And,
yeah.
You know.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, and I think for me, I mean, like I only really like one complication, that's GMT. So if you can get me another time zone, if you can throw it on the bezel, all the better, so you don't have to do anything with the crown. I think that, you know, eventually that'll fail in a lot of watches. So 12-hour bezel can be nice, and you know, some have kind of a split scale. You saw in some of the older stuff that gave you 12 hours along with the countdown, which is fun. Well, thanks very much, everybody, for attending the Why of Dive Watches panel. We'll be around afterwards if you want to continue chatting a bit, but we really appreciate, you know, you taking the time to stop by and listen in, and thanks so much for the questions. It's been a treat.
We would like to thank Audemars Piguet, BMW, Cartier, Grand Seiko, Oris, and Zenith for their support in making this weekend possible.